So today we'll start talking about some of the services that we have, some of the resources you can actually deploy or create. So we'll start with the compute and the networking resources. Now, when I say compute, the first thing that should come to your mind is, you know, um, the virtual machine, which is one of the compute services that we have. And when I say networking, we are talking about, the network. However, here in Azure, or in the cloud, it is not the normal, networking that we know where we have some cables, patch panel, and the light switch and every other thing. You know, all those things, all those switch, all those cables, patch panel, they still exist. However, they now exist in the data center, which is not, feasible to us because we are not, physically present at the data center. So the only thing we get is the virtual network. And that's why here in Azure, we don't talk about network, we talk about the virtual network, which is still, same as the on-premises network, but now we do not physically see, those components that makes up that network. So these are things we'll be looking at. We'll start by, talking about some of the benefits and usage of these compute services. We'll compare the compute services or compute type that we have. Virtual machine, which is one that is common. We'll look at some other compute services like the container instance, the functions. Please, like I said, do not worry about all these, technical terms. You will always, you will catch up with it. You understand all these services and resources and all these terms very soon. Then we'll move ahead to talk about, the virtual machine options that we have. Yes, we have virtual machine, but we have different options of virtual machines. Talking about the VM itself, which is a virtual machine. Then we'll go ahead to talk about the virtual machine skill set, virtual machine availability set, and virtual desktop. Then from there, we'll move on to some of the resources that are required, for you to run a virtual machine. Then we'll describe the hosting platforms that we currently have in Azure, you know, talking about the web apps, containers, and the virtual machine, because all these services can actually be used in hosting, the application. Then we'll move ahead to networking, where we'll talk about the virtual networking, which includes the Azure Virtual Network, virtual subnet peering, the DNS, VPN gateway, express routes. These are just technical terms. You will understand everything at the end of this class. Then we'll talk about the private and the public endpoint. So um, I need you to be, very attentive because this is, I would say, this part. I think even in the exam, it takes like 35% of the exam. So you need to have a very good understanding, you know, of these um of this part for you to at least, because when we start talking about when we move on to the advanced class, we'll actually talk more about these services that we currently have here. So let's move on to the main part of the class today, and let's start talking about all these services and yes, all these services and resources one after the other. So for the guys that are just joining, you've not missed anything. We just started talking about what we have for today. I'm not sure we'll be able to finish it up today, but I will try as much as to make sure that we finish it up today so that we can pick up the next module in the next class if possible. So, you know, I said we are going to talk about the compute and the networking. So to start with, we're starting with the Azure Compute Services. we talked about the fact that there are different services in Azure, which I said, all the services are also, you can term them as a resource because each service you have in Azure have its own resource. So we'll start by talking about the compute, which are the on-demand service, which provides, you can see what they provide. They provide resources, computing resources like the processor, like the disks, like memory, operating system. So when you are looking for any services that provide, the resources like operating system, you know, maybe hard drive, the solid state drive, which is the SSD, the memory, the processor. The first thing that comes to mind is the machine, the laptop, the desktop, or we call it machine in Azure, which virtual machine. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. However, we have some other compute services. You don't need to cram all these guys. You don't need to cram them, but you will still get to understand all these services one after the other after we explain. So aside the virtual machine, we have the app services. Then we have the container instance, we have the Kubernetes, and the Azure Virtual Desktop. So I'm just going to explain these guys so that when we'll start looking at the slides, we'll have a very good understanding or a basic understanding of what each of these compute service or compute type does. So the virtual machine, as you know, is just like the normal machine that we have. Um, yes. So it's just your physical machine in the cloud now. It is not physically accessible to you or by you. However, you still have access to it via a remote desktop or any other tool that you want to use in accessing it. However, so the machine is still on another machine, but you can actually access it. I'm sure one of the exercises, or let's say two of those exercises, is for you to create a virtual machine. I don't know if the exercise actually contains how to access the virtual machine. However, I'm sure I've showed this in the cloud by going to the RDP, which is the remote desktop connection, and try to connect. So the virtual machine can actually be used, as we know, to store our files and folders. Can also be used in hosting applications. So it's an infrastructure as a service, which gives you the access to manage a whole lot compared to the PaaS services and also the SaaS services. Then the next one is going to be the app service. Basically, when you hear app service, you know that this is actually for hosting our application. So that's what we use the app service for. App service is not an infrastructure as a service resource, because you do not have access to the underlying resource. Basically, any hosting service that we are talking about, one thing I need you to know is that all those hosting services, all of them have virtual machine as their underlying technology. So regardless of the hosting platform that we'll talk about today, or in subsequent classes, just know that all of them are still deployed on a virtual machine. The only difference is you do not have access to that virtual machine. You only have access to the platform to deploy your application. And app service is a very good example of that, which is a platform as a service, basically for hosting applications. So when we look at the app service, You can try to, when you try to log into the sandbox, or when you log into the sandbox, you can try to see how to create an app service. It might not allow you to do that, but you will see it will give you the option to select the language of your application. It will give you the ability to select some slots, if you want to do production, to select different environments, maybe dev, production, whatever you name the environment. Like I said, people that are just new to IT or cloud, you do not need to worry yourself about all these technical terms. It will, you know, you understand um them very soon. Then the next one is the container instance. So the container instance and the Azure Kubernetes service, I'm going to explain the two. So let's take it back to the old ways of we hosting our application. So let me explain how we do host application, or how we used to host application back in the days. So what we do is we buy a server. When we purchase a server, it might be a desktop server, as but we are taking it back to, the fact that yes, we have an IT room, then we have a server in there. That server is hosting our application. So there are features on, maybe the Windows or whatever on the server that allows us to host application on that particular server. So when we buy that server, we put in that application, files and folders. So when we say we host applications, the only thing we are, putting in there is the files and folders. So it's not as if the application is, so it's just for users to be able to access that files and folders. That's what we mean by, we hosting our application. So back in the days, you need to purchase one server for one application. So that means if that application is actually, using the minimal part of your CPU or your memory, let's say the application is not heavy, the application is just for um, monitoring timesheets. That means it's not going to consume a whole lot of, space on the server. But the thing is, at that time, at that point in time, we can only have one application stay on one server. That means all the other space that are left, which the application is not consuming, those space are going to be termed as wastage. Even when we try to buy maybe a very minimal desktop or server that will make sure that we do not lose so much space. But at the end of the day, you know, um, it still doesn't make sense because just one application running on one server. So if you want to host another application, you need to go and buy another server, which was actually costing us a lot. So then Microsoft came up with another technology that we call virtualization. You know, that virtualization, what it gives you is, I'm sure some of you might have heard about it. We call it Hyper-V. That virtualization is just the way it sounds, virtualization. So what you do is you can now segregate your your big server, your big size server, maybe into four, into five, depending on how you want to do it. And so what we do is you now, how can I put it? You now divide that particular server, that big server, and let me put it this way. You add it into subs, where you put it into chunks, where you have maybe five virtual machines, or virtual, server running on that particular physical server. So the good thing about this is you can now run multiple applications on one server. You do not need to buy another server when next you want to run another application, because one application is already running on your server. So you can now, because the server is now divided into chunks, then you can run multiple applications. However, the dark side is that virtual servers that you've created are all going to be, you need to now allocate size. The size, each virtual server gets its own size out of the big size. So if you have, let's say, 8 gig RAM, you need to make sure there is actually some part of the RAM that is allocated to the main server. Then you need to allocate the remaining, size. Let's say you are allocating 2 gig RAM to the physical server. Now you are left with 6, so you can now allocate maybe one gig RAM to each of, those virtual servers that you are running. Then the same thing goes with the hard drive. You need to now divide it into chunks and allocate it to each. So one dark side again is the fact that on each virtual server that you have created, you need to now install a fresh operating system. So for people, that are not used to that term, so that's Windows 10, Windows 11, that is actually under your system. That's what we call the operating system. So you need to install it on each of the servers, of that virtual servers that you have created. Is not going to take from the main server, and that's it. So that means at the end of the day, those those virtual servers are still making use of that disk type, that disk, that operating system and the like. So at some point, you might have an application making use of his own virtual server um to the maximum, and you can have another one just taking part or taking a minimum part of the virtual server. Still, you still fall back into the traditional way. However, yes, we now have the option of hosting multiple application on that particular server, which is still fine. Then things started changing. Then there was a switch to what we call the container. Now, this container, the way it works, just the same way I've actually described these virtual servers. The only difference is you do not need to now install an operating system on each of the container you are running, because the container are lightweight. All of them, takes um, you know, they make use of the operating system on the physical machine. So you don't need to now, it's still virtualization. However, you are not going to be installing an operating system on each. So they also, you do not need to now start, allocating sizes of the hard drive to them, except if need be, if there is a need for you to do that when you want to allocate a particular, um, a particular size to that container. But without that, is it will still function. So container instance, the way it works is, instead of we just deploying applications, we can now package our application into one container, and that's the so when we say we package our application, everything that is needed for that application to run, we'll package it in that container and it start running. Don't worry about this term. This is it's just for you to have an overview of this compute type. When we get to the next course, which is the Azure Administrator course, you will have a very good understanding of all these services and technology. So the next one is the Azure Kubernetes service. The way the Kubernetes works is it still manages that container. However, when we have a whole lot of containers, let's say we have 1,000 containers running. So how do we manage these containers? So Azure Kubernetes service steps in. It helps us to manage those containers, automatically. So I'm not going to explain, more about the Azure Container Service and the Kubernetes service, because we'll still get to talk about it. It's just for you to have, an overview of these compute services. Then the last one here is the Azure Virtual Desktop. So the way this works is now I can say, yes, I just joined an organization and I would need to work, um, I will need to work with a system, you know, a system will be allocated to me so that I can access the files and folders or some some corporate, files and folders, from that organization, which I might not be able to do the same on from my, personal system. So instead of the organization now sending a system to me or creating a virtual machine, what they can do is they will say, what are some of the applications that are needed for you to do your job? And I will tell them I need Excel, I need, Virtual Studio. Then they create what we call the Azure Virtual Desktop. The Azure Virtual Desktop will only contain the applications that are needed, for you to perform your job. And they will assign this particular virtual desktop to you. So we have, applications that are used in accessing this virtual desktop. So you can access it just the same way we access the virtual machine. But the only thing is you will only get access to those applications that are needed, by you, not the old virtual machine, you know, in this context. For virtual machine, you have access to hard drive, you have access to, you know, the memory, some other things. But here, you will only have access to those applications that are needed by you to perform your job. So that's what the Azure Virtual Desktop, is. So now let's start talking about these services one after the other. So if you have any question at any point in time, please do let me know. Is important too. So the virtual machine, like I said, I'm sure there is no issue with this. Just our physical system in the cloud. That's just the virtual machine. As you can see, this is a software emulation of our physical system. It's what your system includes, which is the processor, the memory, the storage. You need the networking. For you to be able to connect to that Wi-Fi in your house. For you to be able to connect to the cable. There are some networking resources that actually help in doing this. So just the same way you have your physical machine, that's the same thing that we have in the virtual machine. But the only thing is a software emulation. Then we'll talk about the different virtual machines the type that we have. One of the other option, when we talk about the virtual machine, not the compute type now, the different virtual machine type that we have, we'll talk about the virtual machine skill set. What does virtual machine skill set, does? How does it work? So this is it. In the first class, we started talking about the fact that, you know, back in the days when we write jam and the result comes out, everyone will want to check the results at almost the same time. Let's say 95% of us, even when we know that at the end of the day, it might just be 117 or 180. But everybody wants to go check the result. Maybe that will be a miracle, at that particular time. So we'll go there. You can even get an hour of time. I think it was 120 naira then. Then you will spend that 1 hour at the cafe, you still won't get your results because there are a lot, everyone is trying to check it at the same time. There are a lot of traffic coming or going into that jam website at that particular time, which will, it will cripple, the environment that the application is hosted on. So cloud is saying, yes, we have some services that are actually scalable. Scalable in the sense that when there is a lot of traffic, going into that application, we can have more resources created for you. So we are not scaling up in this case, we are scaling out. So when we talk about scale out, you are adding, more resources. More resources in the sense that you are adding more virtual machines. And that's what the virtual machine scale says. So when you say set, so we are having more than one machine running that application, at a time when there is an increase in traffic. So you can say, I'm creating a virtual machine scale set. When you are creating this virtual machine scale set, if you have created the virtual machine, but now the only difference is you can now decide the number of instance of the virtual machine that you want to create. You can say, when there is traffic, please, I want a maximum of 4 virtual machines to be created for me. It doesn't mean that when there is an increase in traffic, those 4 machines will be created at once. No, it will create one. Then when it notices that, oh, maybe we set a threshold to say, this CPU or this memory, when it gets to 90% of usage, please create a new virtual machine to cater for the incoming traffic. So that's how the virtual machine scale set work. So when there is increase in traffic, another virtual machine will be created for us. Then the threshold gets to 80% again, another machine will be created for us. Then it gets to another 80%, then another machine will be created for us. Let's say these 4 machines are now running. When everybody has checked their jam results and has taken home their zeros, in the morning, when there is no traffic anymore, all these other machines that were created for us, these 2, 3, 4 machines, they will be discarded automatically, and it will go back to just one machine that was running the application before the results actually came out. So that's how the virtual machine scale set work. So we have multiple machines, multiple instance, or more instance of machine that caters for for traffic automatically when there is an increase in traffic. So we call it scaling out. However, there is another name for it, which we call it horizontal scaling. So these are some of this is one of the option of virtual machine scale. So let's look at what we have. So this is another one, which is the availability set. Just the same way we talked about, the availability, the replication strategy. That's the same thing you have here. You can see we're talking about the fact that you can have, this is just one data center, and in that data center you have a rack. This rack is hosting more than one machine. Then you have another rack again, is hosting more than one machine, the same thing. So that means what you want is, this is your machine here. However, you want that same machine to be replicated. It's the same one. This is not multiple, machine like the virtual machine scale set now. It's just one, but what you are doing is you are replicating that machine to, two different other racks so that in case there is an issue with all the machine on this rack, there will be a switch over or a failover to this other rack, or if there is a downtime on this rack and on this rack, there will be a failover to this rack. So that's what we call the availability set. Is just to make sure that you have your machine replicated to different servers within a particular data center. Then we move on to, don't worry, we're still going to talk about the fault domain and what we have there. Here, I'm not going to be creating this virtual machine. I'm sure that was what we did yesterday. However, yeah, after you have created the virtual machine, you need to now install, the web server role, and you need to test. So this web server role, what it does is it allows our machine to act as an application hosting resource. So when we have this role installed on the machine, then we'll be able to create, we'll be able to host application on our machine. Please, if at any point in time you are facing any challenges with any of these labs, please raise it um on the WhatsApp group. You understand? I will try to make sure I create the I think I've been procrastinating. I'll try to make sure I create a Slack environment so that you can drop it and people can actually, give their own contribution. But at least as of now, if you do the same thing on the WhatsApp, people can also comment and tell you where, you are making any mistake. Please make sure you go through all these labs. It's very important. So I'm not going to do this because we've done something related to the virtual machine yesterday. So yes. Then we'll talk about the Azure Virtual Desktop, which I just explained that this is more, instead of we giving you access to the full virtual machine, we are saying what are some of the applications that are needed for you to perform your job. Then we'll only create, that environment for you where you have your apps. So this is the desktop and app virtualization that runs in the cloud. It only gives you access, to your applications. So, yeah, I told you not to worry about this container instance, but at least when I explained the fact that the virtualization where you are able to host multiple applications on your server, and I've told you that this is the same thing, or this is the same way the container instance work. The only thing is the container is a lightweight, environment that allows you to host your application. So one good thing about this is regardless of where the application is hosted before or tested. So some of the time we might have created an application on a Linux server, and we will want to come and test it on a Windows server. Then you will start getting, that error. This is not, applicable, or this is not functioning, or something like that. So because the environment has changed, then you might start having issues, dependency issue, compatibility issues, and that is something container has come to solve, regardless of the environment, regardless of, what language your application is written with. Container gives you that, environment where you can host your application without issues. So as you can see, the definition, they are lightweight virtualized environments. Like I said, they are still virtualized. The only thing is they are all using one operating system. In virtualization, as I've actually explained the other time, when you virtualize, when you do Hyper-V on your server, you still need to install an operating system on each of that virtual server that you've created on your main server. But when you're using the container instance, all of them are making use of the underlying operating system. That means the operating system on the physical machine. So we have the Azure Container Instance, which is, a PaaS service. It runs containers. Then we have the container app, which is also a PaaS service. It works like a virtual machine scale set. It gives you multiple access to, multiple containers. Then we have the Kubernetes service that manages large amount of containers at the same time. So, like I said, you do not need to worry yourself about the container instance for now. Um, it's a bit more technical, so we'll get there. Then the functions. We'll talk about the Azure functions, which is another hosting um, service, hosting service in Azure. But what this does is you're saying just bring your code. We do not even need you to start pushing files. No, those code as you have written them, just come and place it there. This is what we call, serverless hosting. So you don't need to worry about, what platform you want to host it on. You don't need to. Maybe you are talking about, yeah, should we do virtual machine or should we do app service? No. Or you want to see how to now start pushing your files and folder? No. We are saying just bring your code, just that code, the same way you've written it, just come and host it. And that's what we call the serverless hosting. And Azure Functions, is the one that works. Yeah. So in AWS, we call it AWS Lambda. So one good thing about this cloud computing is once you understand Azure, you will understand the AWS. The only difference are the naming conventions. So when you understand all these Azure services, you can go back to AWS to say, oh, this is what you mean. See, all these container instance on AWS is AKS here, is EKS on AWS. The virtual machine is EC2 on AWS. So it's the same service that is running in Azure, that is running in AWS, running in Google Cloud, Oracle Cloud. So once you have a very good understanding of all these services in Azure, on Azure side, then you can actually, translate that knowledge to the other cloud providers. So the only difference are actually the naming conventions. So these are different virtual machine or Azure compute options that we have. We talked about the virtual machine, the virtual desktop, which I explained that it gives you access to that, dedicated experience where you have dedicated applications that are only needed for you, or by you to perform your functions. Then we have the container, which gives you like that lightweight environment for you to run your application without worrying about installing operating system on each of the environment the same way is done on the virtual machine. And the good thing is you can start a container within a minute because they are lightweight compared to a virtual machine. It's just like you are installing your new laptop. That's the same thing you get when you are using a virtual machine, which is different when you're using a container instance. Then the app service, like I said, when you try to create an app service are mainly for you to host your application. It now depends on what application language is it running, what kind of application you are running. So it works with almost um, all languages, application language. So you can just pick up any language and you can select that, while trying to deploy your application. So that's one good thing about the app service. So it's a platform as a service. And like I said, the underlying technology is actually the virtual machine, but you will not see it because it's a platform. But majorly, this Azure App Service is for you to, deploy your applications. The virtual network, yes, it allows, you know, services in Azure or in the cloud to communicate with each other and also to communicate with the internet and also to communicate with our, on-premises devices. So when we talk about on-premises devices, if you have, your system in the office, um, that your server, your printer, they still can communicate, with the resources in Azure, and they can only do this via the virtual network. So we'll talk about the public endpoints. So when we say public, which public, anything public, that means anybody can access. And so the public endpoint accessible from anywhere, on the internet. Then we'll talk about the private endpoint, which is accessible, from within, which is internal. So only from within the premise, the network, you know. Then we'll talk about the virtual subnet. So when you talk about subnet, we are saying we want to divide our network into chunks. So that's why we say subnet. So the virtual subnet, when we deploy resources, we'll put them in different subnets. We don't just put them in the virtual machine. You put them in different subnets in the same way we do our on-premises network, where we try to segregate those resources. Segregate in the sense that we have maybe the main switch, then we have another switch that goes into MD's office. Only MD is using that particular switch. Then we have maybe switch for the finance team. So we're trying to divide that particular network into chunks. The same way we can actually divide, that virtual network here into chunks. Then we'll talk about the VNet pairing, the network pairing. The network pairing in the sense that, let's say we are a global organization and we've deployed our resources, in US. Then there is another company in the UK that have deployed their resources, but we want these guys to be able to talk to each other, like their system to be able to communicate. Then we'll do what we call the peering, which means we'll pair two networks together for them to, communicate with each other. So that's what we'll be talking about in this series. I think we can, because this will take us a while. I think we can stop it there, then we can just continue from, the networking in the next class. Let's just take a look at this. Then from there we can call it a day. So the walkthrough, just the same way we have it on the virtual machine, but let me just. So this is telling us to, on our virtual machine that you've created, you need to open some ports. We need to create what we call the network security group. We need to open HTTP access port 80 and test our connection. So this is it. When we deploy applications, we need to also, when we deploy networks, we need to, when we create our network, we need to secure the network, everything we create, so that there is no, attack. There are no attack from the outside or from the internet. We want to make sure that, we restrict access to that particular network, because we don't just want to keep it open-ended. When we keep it open, anyone from anywhere can access that particular network. So we'll create what we call a network security group. That network security group is used in securing our application, our network. So what this does is, that network security group, what it does is, it allows you, to control what comes in and what goes out from your network. So we have some rules that you can set on that network to say only computer on this particular IP can access this network. Only computers on this IP can access the internet. So we try to create some rules. Then guys should, try to look at the labs and try to make sure you create this rule just to test the connection, to be sure that yes, whatever you've created, you are still able to access. This should tell you, to access one particular IP on port 80, if you deny access to that particular port 80, it will not allow anyone to come in, into that particular port or to get to that particular port. So with this now, then that's what the security give. If you add the port 80, then you will be able to access, that particular port. So when you host an application in Azure or when you host an application on a machine, you need to make sure that this particular port 80 is open. We'll get there, you know. So when we host application, you see all those applications that you are hosting, those google.com, all those amazon.com, they are actually accessible on this particular port, which is port 80. You will not see it, but that's what is working behind the scene. Then when we use this HTTPS, where you have the SSL, that certificate, that security that you can see, we'll access it on port 443, but you will not see it. But that's the way, that technology works. But so try to, take a look at this. I'm going to share the links, on the WhatsApp group. You can pick it up from there. Bye, everyone.